In 1885, a 22-year-old woman challenged a famous gunslinger to a duel right in the middle of the street. She won. He died. And her name? You've never heard it. That's no accident. It was by design. For more than a century, editors, politicians, and historians deliberately erased the most dangerous, wealthy, and powerful women of the Old West. In this video, you're gonna meet 25 of them, and the last one was more feared than Billy the Kid. Number 1. Most women in the West carried guns. That wasn't the exception, it was the rule. Store records in Dodge City and Tombstone show that women bought revolvers almost as often as men did. Small derringers became a common item for them, hidden in purses and even in corsets. That whole idea of a fragile young woman waiting to be saved by a cowboy. Pure Hollywood fiction. In real life, a lot of these women carried a .32 caliber and knew exactly how to use it. In isolated areas, where the law basically didn't exist, knowing how to shoot wasn't a matter of style. It was a matter of survival. And there's one detail almost nobody talks about. A lot of them were better shots than their husbands. Number 2. Women who owned saloons controlled entire towns. Everyone thinks the sheriff ran the town, right? Not always. In many Old West towns, the people who really ran things were the women in charge of the saloons. Think about it. The saloon was where men spent money, made deals, worked out political agreements, and loosened their tongues after a few drinks. The woman who owned that place heard everything, knew everything, and decided who got in and who got thrown out. She controlled the flow of money and information at the same time. In places like Tombstone and Dodge City, politicians went to those saloons to ask for these women's support before any election. The real center of power wasn't the mayor's office. It was the bar of a woman most history books simply pretended never existed. Number 3. Soiled doves was the polite term. The truth was very different. History books boiled these women down to a single word. But what nobody tells you is that many of them owned entire properties, lent money at high interest, and built up more wealth than the ranchers and merchants in the area. Some of them helped fund the building of schools and churches in the same towns that publicly condemned them. The label was never about morality. It was about hiding the real economic power these women gained at a time when they couldn't even open a bank account in their own name. And the question nobody asks is, why did the most influential men in those towns never want that part of the story to be told? Number 4. History books always treated Annie Oakley like an exception, like she was the only woman in the Old West who knew how to shoot. That's not true. Lillian Smith joined Buffalo Bill's show when she was just 15 and competed directly with Oakley. But there were many others, women who entered official shooting competitions and beat experienced men without any kind of advantage. It wasn't luck. It wasn't some circus gimmick. They were just better shots. Records show that Wild West show promoters recruited women sharpshooters because audiences would pay to see what they didn't believe was possible. And the more those women won, the more money the organizers made. Nobody called that equality back then. They called it entertainment. But knowing how to shoot was only the beginning. Some of these women weren't satisfied with competing. They crossed the line into outlaw territory. Number 5. Pearl Hart, the last female stagecoach robber in American history. By 1899, the Old West was pretty much over. Trains had replaced stagecoaches, and the law had made it to the territories. But Pearl Hart didn't care about any of that. She cut her hair short, dressed like a man, grabbed a .38 revolver, and robbed a stagecoach in Arizona. She took $430 from the passengers. When she was arrested, the press lost its mind, not because of the robbery itself, but because a woman had done it. The trial turned into a circus. Pearl said no man had the right to judge her because women couldn't vote. She was sentenced to 5 years, but she only served a year and a half. The official reason for letting her out? That prison was no proper place for a lady. The same system that convicted her used her femininity to set her free. Number 6. Flora Quick, the horse thief no sheriff could catch. Flora Quick operated in Indian Territory, stealing horses right under the authorities' noses. She wore men's clothing, changed routes every week, and knew trails no posse could follow. The sheriffs would catch her, and she'd escape. They'd catch her again, and she'd disappear, all over again. It got to the point where local newspapers didn't know whether to cover her as a dangerous criminal or as a joke, because every time she got away, it was the lawmen who looked bad. And here's the detail nobody talks about. She wasn't working alone. Flora had a network of contacts spread across the territory, helping hide the horses and throw off anyone chasing her. The whole system kept failing against a woman who, according to records from the time, was barely in her 20s when she started.
Number 7. Belle Starr wasn't just any outlaw. She led men who were outlaws. She ran a horse-stealing network, hid people running from the law, and was said to have direct connections to Jesse James. She married a Cherokee warrior named Sam Starr, and together they became the most wanted couple in Indian Territory. Belle carried 2 revolvers, rode fine horses, and wore velvet like she was part of high society. She was arrested, put on trial, and still kept operating. But in February 1889, 2 days before her 41st birthday, someone shot her in the back on a dirt road near her ranch. She fell off her horse and died right there. No one was ever convicted of the crime. To this day, it's one of the oldest cold cases in the Old West, and the main suspect was her own son. Number 8. Laura Bullion was the only woman accepted into the Wild Bunch, Butch Cassidy's gang. She grew up around outlaws, learned to shoot as a child, and before long she was taking part in train robberies. She also passed counterfeit money through towns across the West. In 1901, she was arrested and sent to a penitentiary in New York. She served her time and got out in 1905. After that, she simply disappeared. She lived the rest of her life quietly, without drawing anyone's attention. The striking part is that Laura didn't die until 1961. She lived to see the Old West disappear, made it through 2 world wars, and reached the era of color television. A woman who robbed trains with Butch Cassidy lived long enough to see mankind getting ready to go into space. Everything she lived through died with her. Number 9. Etta Place. Nobody knows who she really was or where she came from. She appeared out of nowhere alongside the Sundance Kid, traveled with him and Butch Cassidy all the way to Argentina, and helped with bank robberies down there in South America. And then she simply vanished. There's no death certificate, no grave, no record of her anywhere after 1906. Some say she went back to the United States under a fake name and lived an ordinary life. Others swear she died in a tiny town somewhere in Patagonia. The truth is, nobody ever found out. She's a ghost history was never able to track down. These women broke the law without blinking. But the next ones did something the Old West considered even worse. They broke gender rules. Number 10. Charley Parkhurst was one of the most respected stagecoach drivers in California. He drove stagecoaches along dangerous roads, faced off with bandits, and even lost an eye in a horse accident. In saloons, he drank, smoked cigars, and spit on the floor like any other guy. In 1868, Charley voted in the presidential election, something no woman was allowed to do at the time. He lived that way for decades, without anyone suspecting a thing, When he died in 1879, the doctor who examined the body was shocked. Charley was actually Charlotte. The whole town had been fooled for years. But what was even more surprising was that Charlotte had given birth at some point in life. That means she hid not just her identity, but an entire story we'll never know. 50 years before women's suffrage, this person had already voted as an American citizen. Number 11, Mountain Charley wasn't some tough old West man. She was Elsa Jane Guerin, a 15-year-old widow who decided starving to death was not an option. She cut her hair, put on men's clothes, and disappeared into the world. For 13 years, she worked in mines, drove mule teams, opened businesses, and nobody suspected a thing. In April 1, she published an autobiography telling the whole story. And what happened? Nothing. Society simply pretended it hadn't read it, because admitting that a woman had survived on her own better than most men was something nobody wanted to face. The book was pretty much forgotten for decades, not because it was a lie, but because it was too true. Number 12, Lozin, the Apache warrior the Americans tried to erase. She was Chief Victorio's sister and fought beside him in real battles against the United States Army. Apache warriors themselves said she had an almost supernatural ability to sense the presence of enemies before any scout could. Lozin never married and refused any domestic role. When Victorio was killed, she kept fighting alongside Geronimo. She was captured and sent to Florida as a prisoner of war, where she died of tuberculosis far from her homeland. And in American history books, hardly any mention of her for decades. A woman who stood up to an entire army simply vanished from the official record. Number 13, Charley Parkhurst and Mountain Charley are the best known, but frontier records show dozens of cases of women living as men. Frontier records show dozens of women who lived as men in the Old West. Some were only discovered when the doctor prepared the body for burial. Others were never discovered. Mountain Charley fought in the Civil War without anyone suspecting a thing. Little Joe Monahan worked on ranches for years in Idaho. The truth is simple. The rules of that society were so harsh on women that many came to the conclusion that the only way to have freedom was to give up their own identity. But the next women we're going to see didn't need to hide. They dominated the Old West by being exactly who they were. Number 14, Mary Fields was over 6 feet tall, smoked cigars, and carried both a revolver and a rifle. She was the first black woman to work for the U.S. Postal Service, delivering mail on one of the most dangerous routes in Montana. Heavy snow, wolves, and bandits were all part of the job. One night, her horses froze to death during a blizzard. Want to know what she did? She threw the mail sack over her shoulders and walked for miles in the dark to the next town. She never missed a single delivery. Locals said not even the sheriff scared people as much as she did. She had a reputation for taking down any man who caused trouble. They say she once knocked a guy out with a single punch. No wonder she became known as Stagecoach Mary, a nickname nobody dared say to her face. Number 15. Nellie Cashman made real money in mining in Alaska and Arizona at a time when women could barely even open a bank account. She invested in mines, ran restaurants, and even paid for hospitals out of her own pocket. But what really drove people crazy was something else. Every time a journalist asked why she had never gotten married, her answer was always the same. I don't have time for a husband. Simple as that. At a time when marriage was pretty much the only acceptable option for a woman, Nellie ignored that rule her whole life. And the most impressive part is that nobody managed to force her. Not society, not the church, not the pressure from the men around her. She died at 73, single, wealthy, and in charge of her own choices. This kind of woman existed in the Old West, But history books would rather not tell that story. Number 16.